Well, tonight I'm going to talk to you about a particular way of thinking about alternatives to capitalism and about how to move from here to there. Big order of problems, especially in a world where most people take capitalism for granted, even if they feel deeply harmed and alienated by its structures. 50 years ago, actually 52 years ago, right about this time of the year, a little bit east of here, near Detroit, a group of young 20-somethings of the era gathered at a place called Port Huron to craft the manifesto of Students for a Democratic Society. And I'd like to read to you a short passage from the introduction to that document called Agenda for a Generation, written 1962, spring of 1962. In this is perhaps the outstanding paradox. We ourselves are imbued with urgency, yet the message of our society is that there is no viable alternative to the present. Beneath the stagnation of those who have closed their minds to the future is the pervading feeling that there simply are no alternatives, that our times have witnessed the exhaustion not only of utopias, but of any new departures as well. And a little bit later, continues, it has been said that our liberal and socialist predecessors were plagued by vision without program, while our own generation is plagued by program without vision. Theoretic chaos has replaced the idealistic thinking of old, and unable to reconstitute the theoretic order, people have condemned idealism itself. Doubt has replaced hopefulness, and people act out of a defeatism that is labeled realistic. The decline of utopia and hope is in fact one of the defining features of social life today. Now there are two things, many things striking about this incredible passage, but two things I want to stress. One is that much of it sounds like it could be written today, but also it was written just before what we now call the 1960s. 1962 is kind of the end of the 1950s, so to speak. You know, within a few years, you have May 68 in France, where one of the defining slogans is Soyez réalistique, demandez l'impossible, be realistic, demand the impossible. This is written in 1962. We're at the end of hope. Idealism is dead, and then, boom, we get the 1960s. But of course, not that long afterwards, Margaret Thatcher declares there is no alternative in the early 1980s. But then, before that much time has passed, the World Social Forum in 2000 adopts as its slogan, another world is possible. Now, I'm saying this not to invoke a mantra of le plus ça change, le plus c'est la même chose, that we just go through cycles of endless, fantastic idealism and depths of despair, cycling back and forth, but rather to emphasize the deep unpredictability of what the future holds and the new possibilities that emerge, and the continual resurgence of a utopian expectation of dramatic and radical new possibilities. There is thus a kind of clash of slogans. There is no alternative. Pretty much still, I think, a central core idea, the narrowing of visions and expectations, but equally, continually pressing, re-emerging, another world is possible. I invoke Utopia to suggest we seek alternatives to dominant institutions that embody our deepest aspirations for a just and humane world, and that we do so without cynicism. The naivete of Utopia is actually something I think we should, in one sense, embrace. Not, of course, in the sense that we want our real analysis of the world to be naive, but we want it to be open-hearted and earnest, and not imbued with cynicism right from the start. We want to announce and defend the ideals forthrightly. That's the utopian moment of the couplet. But we also want alternatives that can be built in the world as it is, that also prefigure the world as it could and perhaps as it should be. That's the real and the real utopia. Looking for alternatives in which we can prefiguratively build forms or elements or partial realizations of them that embody the ideals we seek to instantiate in the world at large. And then, and this becomes the, if you will, the kind of deeper tweak of this idea, to build alternatives that not only prefigure the alternative world we desire, but also move us in the direction of that world rather than closing off spaces. This is embedded in a bigger agenda, which I call emancipatory social science, of which the Marxist tradition is probably the most elaborated tradition of thought, but by no means the only one. I certainly include feminist theory and critical environmental analysis and all sorts of other strands of radical and critical theory as in this family of theories that I will call emancipatory social science. And emancipatory social science faces 4 tasks: elaborating the moral foundations, which is certainly something that the Marxist tradition has usually been nervous about, if not negatively oriented to. Elaborate the moral foundations, the diagnosis and critique of existing institutions in terms of those foundations, the elaboration of alternatives on the basis of those moral foundations in light of the diagnosis and critique of the world as it is, and a theory of transformation that tells you something about how to get from here to there. My moral foundations, here they are. 4 principles: equality, democracy, community, and solidarity. It's a couplet. And sustainability. Let me give you the bottom line definition of each of these as I use it in my own thinking on these problems. So these, remember, these are the moral foundations on which we will then make judgments about our own institutions and think through the problem of alternatives that will better realize these institutions and then how to transform the world in ways that move us in that direction. Equality. Equality. In a just society, all persons would have broadly equal access to the material and social means necessary to live a flourishing life. That's a complicated formulation. It has lots of stuff in it. Any of you who have studied political theory will note various code words that signal affiliation to particular strands of thought around this. Democracy. In a fully democratic society, all people would have broadly equal access to the necessary means to participate meaningfully in decisions about things which affect their lives. Another mouthful, lots of elements there. Democracy is an egalitarian principle about power, and it specifies that principle in terms of, at least the way I am using this, developing this concept, access to the means to participate in decisions about which affect your life. It's essentially, therefore, a value about self-determination. When the decisions in question affect you and nobody else, we call it liberty. You should be able to do what you want without asking permission as long as it doesn't affect other people. If it affects other people, they should be part of the decision-making. It affects them a little, well, maybe not. So you have to draw lines of demarcation. But the principle is that if you're doing things that affect the lives of other people in significant ways, they should be co-participants in the decisions. Pretty simple, straightforward. It means that freedom and democracy are not different values. They just apply in different contexts. One is the context of decisions which are really just your business because they're not going to affect others. Others apply in contexts where what you're doing and choosing has effects on other people. They should be party to the decisions. Community and solidarity. Community and solidarity expresses the principle that people ought to cooperate with each other, not simply because of what they personally get out of it, but also out of a real commitment to the well-being of others. And sustainability stipulates future generations should have access to the social and material means to live flourishing lives, at least at the same level as the present generation. I treat sustainability in an anthropocentric way. Those are my principles. Now, we use those principles for diagnosis and critique. First, And I'm applying this to capitalism. The general format of this framework can be used for any object of social inquiry. You can study gender relations using the same criteria. Ethnicity, race, disability, whatever. You can still ask what are the moral principles, how to use them for a diagnosis and critique of existing social institutions with respect to that problem, and so on. I'm focusing on capitalism here. Equality. Capitalism perpetuates eliminable forms of human suffering and deficits in human flourishing. It inherently generates levels of inequality in income and wealth that systematically violate social justice. It's not that it contingently does so, it inherently does so. Now that doesn't mean that nothing can be done about it. Indeed, it's possible, as we know from the history of the 20th century, that some capitalist societies managed to do quite a lot to neutralize the inegalitarian effects of the ordinary workings of capitalism. But they did so by creating non-capitalist institutions that would counteract those effects. The welfare state takes resources out of capitalist circulation and returns them to people in ways that mitigates the inequalities of capitalism. Democracy. Capitalism generates severe deficits in realizing democratic values by excluding crucial decisions from public deliberation, by allowing private wealth to affect access to political power. The United States specializes in that problem. And by allowing workplace dictatorships. The first of these, I think, is the most fundamental to capitalism because it's intrinsic to the very notion of private ownership of the means of production. And what does private ownership mean? If you own a factory, it's yours, it's your property. The one thing you have a real right to do is close it down and move your resources elsewhere. The fact that closing a factory and moving it to a low-wage economy will destroy the home values of thousands of people in the community where the factory was located, not just those who worked in the factory, but because of its economic effects, conceivably of almost everybody in that community, is irrelevant. You don't have to take it into account. And indeed, in some sense, you're prohibited. You're normatively told not to take it into account. Shareholder value matters more than homeowner value because you're accountable to the share owners of your firm. You're not accountable to the homeowners. That is undemocratic in the sense that it excludes people from participation in decisions which massively affect their lives, and it excludes them with the force of law. They are prevented from participating in such decisions. Community and solidarity. Competition and commodification within capitalism undermine community and solidarity. And finally, sustainability. Capitalism inherently threatens the quality of the environment for future generations because of imperatives for consumerism and endless growth.